Hello there, I'm Aldrahill, and welcome to some tips you didn't know about Imperator, or Imperator something. Early access to Imperator was very kindly provided by Paradox, and I've also recently played in the big old influencer war that was over the weekend, a highlight of which will be going up on my channel very shortly. However, now that the embargo for Imperator is up, I wanted to put out a lot of videos for this game, including Let's Plays and other edited stuff, but I also wanted to make a tips and tricks video. Because there are a lot of things about this game, being that it's a new game, that you probably didn't know. I'm going to try and avoid as much meminess as possible with this video, but I will start with the tips being more obvious and then go down to more esoteric and confusing as I go on. Some of these are game strategy tips, things that you would know if you play the game quite a lot, but wouldn't know if you just started getting into the game. Later on, the tips are going to be a bit, weirder and maybe a bit more esoteric and maybe even will be changed. Quick note before I start, this is a preview build of the game, so things are subject to change, so it is possible some of the things I say will be invalidated. Okay, first up is military tactics effectiveness. Individual armies can have individual military tactics, whose effectiveness is determined by unit composition. This is actually pretty similar to CK2's battle system, where individual flanks can take on different strategies based on what happens around them and the martial skill of their leader, but in Imperator, at least for now, you actually directly control the tactics for each army. These tactics have an effectiveness rating, as well as having a kind of rock, paper, scissors type strategy against other tactics. For example, the default tactic, Shock, increases casualties by 10% for both sides, but it is also more effective against the envelopment tactic. However, it is worse against the bottleneck and phalanx tactic. Now, these are all pretty basic things you could have got from the dev diary, but also individual tactics have an effectiveness rating that is determined by your army's unit composition. Shock, for example, has a 33% effectiveness rating for heavy infantry. So if you have only 33% heavy infantry in your army, it will only have a 33% effectiveness and thus only give you 33% of its benefit. The trick here is that this means that individual unit compositions in armies have a mathematically best tactic. Obviously, it can change based on what the enemy is likely to pick, but it means you can predict what the AI is going to pick based on their unit composition. As you can see in the Rome starting army, it has a unit of 5 archers, 5 heavy infantry, and 5 light cavalry. Shock only has a 33% effectiveness, but Bottleneck has a 49% effectiveness. Although I don't know the exact AI weights they assign to it, it is safe to assume that it is based on their unit composition, so you can predict what they're going to pick and then pick the opposite. Further to this, the AI is actually limited to only 15% archers. This is also the case with light cavalry. This means enemy AI armies will only ever have up to 15% in archers and light cavalry when they have the ability to change and remodel their armies. So at the beginning of the game, you might see different balanced armies, but as the AI builds and rebuilds their armies, you're not really going to see more than about 15% archers and light cavalry, so bear that in mind. This next tip is concerning resources. You have resources within individual cities and provinces, and you can export excess resources that you have to spare. You can either keep these resources for yourself and get a small amount of benefit. For example, every additional salt that your country has, you get a reduction of 5% army maintenance costs. You also get additional bonuses for having an excess quantity of trade goods. However, if you export them to another nation, whether that be an AI nation or a player nation if you're doing multiplayer, you will still get the bonus from that resource you traded away, just at a 50% reduction. So in the case of salt, if you export it away, you get a 2.5% reduction in maintenance costs rather than 5%. The main benefit, of course, by trading away is you give it to another nation, but also you get the money from trading it. Next tip is about wars. This is about the war goals that you can do when you declare a war. When you attack a nation, you can either do it with a conquer war goal, with a supremacy war goal, or a naval supremacy war goal. If you attack with a conquer war goal, provinces will cost 25% less to claim in the eventual war score screen. However, if you attack with a show superiority war goal, which is basically kind of the same as a no CB in other games, then they cost 200%. If it's a naval superiority war, it is 1000%. The only real reason it would seem you would do a show naval superiority is to try and destroy their nation's navy and to just generally weaken them. You won't be able to take any provinces. From here on out, the tips get a a little weirder and less interesting, but this one's still pretty cool. Individual cities have terrains, as in all other Paradox games, of course, and those terrains determine movement penalties and defensive penalties, etc., etc. You probably just think that they all reduce speed in the same way, but in actuality, strangely enough, a forest is worse for movement than hills. If you walk through a forest, you have a 30% increase in movement costs, hills are 20%, marsh is 50%, and mountains is a whopping 80%. It makes sense, but it's strange that forests slow you down so much. This next tip is kind of like two things that are just something quite interesting I noticed in the game code, one of which is about desecrating holy sites. Desecrating holy sites is a very interesting thing you can do when you are in an enemy's territory, and it basically lowers citizen, freeman, and tribesman happiness by about 10%. I think the value can change in the nations as well, though. And it also reduces their omen power for about 5 years. Basically, it means you can wreck them. By paying a little bit of power, you're basically allowed to reduce the happiness of an enemy nation, and hopefully make them more likely to rebel and give them less resources when they take it back. However, interestingly, the AI will not desecrate holy sites if the nation that they're standing on is less than 40 cohorts. In the notes section of this bit of the code, it explains that it doesn't want to do it to a small nation. I presume this is to make sure that you don't just get immediately destroyed by being sieged down, because it is actually a very powerful tactic. So it is good that the AI isn't able to do it. You know, unless you have a bigger army. The other interesting thing in the code is that you are unable to die of natural causes before the age of 65. Imperator is kind of described as a mix of EU4 and CK2, with having a kind of CK2 characters, but they're not the focus of the game. In CK2, characters can die of natural causes at varying years based on certain traits, but in Imperator, they can only die of natural causes after the age of 65. They are not able to do so before that. They can die from other things, they can be executed, they can get illnesses, all kinds of bad stuff, but they cannot die of natural causes before 65. The other thing I noticed in the code, and this is so totally meaningless, there is with Terems an ability called ramming tactics, which increases your attack by 10% and reduces defense by 10%. In the game code, it's called ramming speed. I just think that's really fun. This next tip is something that is going to be a little bit obvious for people if you play the game a little bit, but something that really did mess me up when I started playing. Your research rate is determined by the proportion of citizens you have in your empire. This means if you have an absolute ton of slaves that you've recently acquired from, oh, I don't know, destroying Phrygia in a massive multiplayer game and kicking Spiffing's butt, then your research ratio is actually going to be massively imbalanced, and you're not going to make very much research at all, and your tech is going to slow down. You might not think this is a big deal at the start, but it really, really is. If a technology gets too low in comparison to other nations, you are going to really struggle with trying to keep up in combat, in just happiness and everything. It's really hard if you have low tech. There is a bit of an exploit at the moment where you are able to essentially just make almost 100% citizens and then just have huge amounts of research, and even a weird Pictish tribe in Scotland is thus able to massively outpace everyone else with research. There is a video on the Spiffing Brits channel that details this, which I will link to in the description, but essentially it weakens everything else so as to increase your research rate. It's not really that strong, but it's kind of cool. It's also a lot easier if you are playing clans because you get free retinues from the other clans. Finally, the last thing I'm going to mention is something that will almost certainly be deleted at some point, but it's something called a debug event, and it is called Johan 1, which I just love. And this is a very strange event you can do as Rome. When you trigger this event, you get a bunch of choices without much text, and it's all very silly, and it would appear to be a debug event that's all about testing for the Marian reforms. For those not in the know, the Marian reforms were a series of military reforms conducted in the Roman army by Gaius Marius. If you've ever played Rome Total War, they feature pretty heavily. And they happen about 200 years after the game's start. So I'm not actually sure if the Marian reforms do take place in the scope of the game, or if they are able to be done in Rome, and if they're going to change it heavily or just add some bonuses to units. I'm not sure, but it remains to be seen. I hope you've enjoyed these little tips, and some of them are just small things you didn't probably know about the game. Imperator releases very soon, so I do hope you guys enjoy the game. And I'm sure there is an absolute ton more information out there that still remains to be found out and discovered by other YouTubers and better players than me. If you have enjoyed this little tip video, do be sure to leave me a like and a comment on the video, and hit subscribe if you want to see more edited videos, tips, tricks, and maybe let's plays. I really can't decide if I want to do edited videos or let's plays, or I don't know. But regardless, let me know what you think in the comments below. I was Aldrahill and I continue to be, and this has been some Imperator, I don't know, tips and tricks. Bye-bye.